Please. Okay. So Baruch Hashem, there was a tremendous feedback last week. We got a lot of calls and comments, and Baruch Hashem was all positive. And I do want to mention first of all, anyway, it's necessary to recap a few points because some of the things that we're going to be mamshech, it has to do with, we have to make a quick recap. So let me start with that and then add one more point to what we discussed about potato chips. So the recap is necessary as follows. We spoke about Pas Akkum and Maacholei Akkum. So Pas Akkum, the main important point that's necessary to know is that there's a din called Pas Palter. There's a din called Pal. I actually don't like the echo. Everybody here is able to hear me. It's fine. That there's a din called Pas Palter. That means if the bread is baked to chatchila for the purpose of selling it or giving it away, it's not the guy's own personal bread. So then meikar adin, that's mutter for a yid to eat. There's a machlekes between the Chaber and the Ramah. That's only if Pas Yisrael is not available. But then there's the chumrah of the Arizal. Not, it's again the Torah's chumrah. Reitzali is chassid, is to refrain from eating Pas Palter unless mamish, you have nothing else to eat at all. But otherwise, you bake your own bread. Even in a case which Maacholei Alma, you're allowed to have Pas Palter because Pas Yisrael is not available at all. Afal Pikein is a chumrah of the Arizal. So that's what's kept generally in the Das Sidim. We follow this chumrah of the Arizal, but there's chumrah. In terms of Bishul Akkum, which means something which is not in the gather of Pas, which we explained last time how that works. It goes basically according to the halachas of Birchas Hanenin. Something's not in the gather of a Pas, then it has a dinim of a Tafshil. So then it follows the rules of Bishul Akkum. So then by Bishul Akkum, the halacha is that it doesn't make a difference if it was baked for the purpose of selling it or giving it away, or it's the guy's own personal thing. It's always going to be aser. However, there's two conditions. Number one, it's only going to be aser if you have number one, that it's not nechol chai, something which was not edible before the guy cooked it. And number two, that it has to be something which is oila shulchan malachim, something chashuv. And we spent most of the time explaining and explaining al pi svara and proving from the Mekayris and the Paskin that what it means, al pi din oila shulchan malachim, is that what's fit to be served at a very, very formal suda of the, it doesn't have to be dafka a president or a king, that's clear in the Paskin, but after Pekin, it has to be a very formal suda. So therefore, all snack foods, it's angenommen by all the kashrus organizations, al pi meikar hadin, that all types of snack food like potato chip, but the mayan do not really need to be meikar hadin bishul Yisrael, and it's not necessary for Mashgiach to come in and turn on the fire in these things. What we discussed is that b'Torah's chumrah, it could be that based on the Arizal, similar vart is in the Shach, that b'Torah's chumrah, that to refrain from eating all things that were cooked by a goy, that's that, and that applies whether it's something which is not oil shulchan malachim, that even applies something which is nechol chai, if you follow that chumrah of the Arizal. But again, that's only with the chumrah, so it's not necessarily upgefrek that you should follow it in certain instances or with certain products that are available versus when you're traveling or other products that are not available, you don't necessarily keep it because that's totally b'teres chumrah, and it's not that you're being choishish for a certain shita, because that basically we spent the majority of last year kind of explaining and proving that there really isn't really much place in the paskim themselves to be concerned for those types of foods. I wanted to add one ha'ara. We explained at the end of the year that although we prove that it doesn't go according to the min oichel, we don't say that since you could make roasted potatoes out of potatoes, so therefore potato chips also have to be bishul Yisrael. It goes according to the min tafshil. So roasted potatoes are oila shulchan malachim, so they have to be prepared by a yid. Mashenk and potato chips are a snack food. They're not oila shulchan malachim, so therefore they're not subject to the rules of bishul Akkum. That's what we spent last year proving. But we explained that there's a certain element of loy plug or of einon ubekiyin. So lamashal, mashed potatoes, it doesn't have to be that this plate of mashed potatoes you're eating is suitable to be served at a state dinner in the White House. Can move on that when it's prepared over there, it's going to be prepared much nicer and much better, especially if you're talking about meat and stuff like that. It's going to be a much higher quality. So we don't say that because you got not such a high quality piece of meat, we based it on a pri chadash, that we don't say, we're not machalik between, we say, oh, this is a good piece of meat, that's not such a good piece of meat, because we don't want to have to start judging and being machalik in every situation. So there is an element of loy plug. So someone was mayor to me after the show yesterday that some Rabbanim want to extend this concept a little bit also to the idea of the process that's being done. In other words, they want it kind of like this, that if you could have, which is, the etzem time is 100% correct, that within a certain kind of tafshil, you can't start nitpicking and saying, Marshall, you go into the freezer section in a well-stocked supermarket, so you're going to find 10 different kinds of French fries, shoestring, steak cut, many different sizes and shapes of French fries. So you're not going to start saying, and this is 100% correct, this is included in what we said, you're not going to tell that the steak cut French fries that you'll get at a fancy restaurant or whatever it is, that's going to be a shulchan malach, masha ink in the shoestring. That's a no. So we're not machal because French fries is French fries. That's 100% correct. What he was timing is that they want to extend that concept to potato chips. That it's fried potatoes. So mamela, that's all included in the ein on the bikim. Of what we were saying. So that's already the daitya kopanim, it's a stretch on two levels. First of all, according to the definition that we gave last time, even French fries are not oil shulchan malachim. They're taka sold in fancy restaurants, but they're not at a formal dinner. So that's okay, but that's already questionable. And even so, it's clearly, although this part, like I said, the mashal would be the different kind of French fries that you could find in the store. There's afapi that they each have different Shem Levy, this is a shoestring kind of a French fry, and this is a steak cut kind of a French fry. So we're not mechalik. That's 100%. I'm asking 100%. It makes perfect sense. But ledaiti lachoyre, a French fry and a potato chip are lachoyre two different gedarim, and it's obvious saying the name and saying the taste and saying the style. So I would think that application. But again, that's all my personal thing. But I did want to share it. Someone was mayor, and he said that some Rabbanim hold like this, and maybe even some kashrus agencies try to apply this idea. So again, the idea here is not to promote one thing or the other, not that I'm a rav, not that I work in the kashrus industry, I'm a teacher. So my point is just to explain stuff to adarabah. So someone was made at that point. There's definitely the concept, it definitely has to be, in other words, it was actually included in what we explained last week, the application. So we just wanted to share that with you. So that was one point that I wanted to say. Now I wanted to be mamshech. We had actually on the list from last week, we were supposed to talk, but we ran out of time to talk a little bit about the breakfast cereals. So breakfast cereals, you have basically two kinds. You have the kinds that are not mezoinus. So they're either hadam or sha'akol. Let's say the cornflakes or the rice or whatever it is, the different kind of cereals that are not made out of the chameshus minei dagan. So if they're not made out of the chameshus minei dagan, so it's not even a question that they can't, by definition, be in the category of a pass. Okay, so they're governed by the klolim of Maacholei Akkum. So again, it basically would be the question of what we discussed last week of what exactly is the gather of Oilo Shulchan Malachim. It's generally accepted based on the definition that we gave last time, Sayal Pisvara and Saifim Mekayris, that it means what's served at a formal type suda. So l'chayra, it's generally assumed that that's not like that. That even at a type of a breakfast, doesn't have to be a dinner per se, it could be a breakfast. But even a breakfast, so you're gonna get an omelet. What do you get at a bris? A fancy bris? Yeah, you get an omelet, and you can get pancakes, and you can get waffles, and you're gonna get French toast. Maybe you're not gonna get maybe the kids' table. You're not gonna get. They're not gonna put down the Rice Krispies in camp. That's in yeshiva. They dump down a thing of. But that's not the way it's done, l'chayr. So that's generally what's assumed, and based on that, there's no issue really of Maacholei Akkum. But again, based on what we said last time, it's out of chumrah. Based on the shach from the Rizal, definitely there's Maacholei Akkum to prefer, but if it's available, to prefer the Yiddish company. There's no question about that. But in terms of the requirements, al pi din, l'chayr, there isn't really that much of a concern. Now, if we're talking about the kinds of cereal that might be that are mezoinus, which means that let's say they're made out of the chameshus minei dagan, so then you have to go into the question, it could potentially be pas. But we explained the gedarim of what's considered pas, what comes out the flawless is that it goes according to the klal, like we explained last time of birchas hanenin. So if something would be, even if it's lechem she'eina gomer, that therefore the brachas mezainis. But if you would make a shir, you would eat a shir kvi of suda, so you would have to wash them then. So then it could be considered a pas. So that would basically bechlolus. There's three criteria. There's that it's made out of flour and water, and that it's turned into a dough, and that it's baked. Almost something that could be made out of flour. Let's say you have lukshin, right? It could be made out of flour and water and into a dough, but because it's cooked, so it's never going to be hamoitzi. It's never going to be a pas. But that's where it's in the category of again. But usually when you buy raw pasta, it's not an issue because you're the one cooking it. But I'm just saying that that's never going to be in the category of a pas. Let's say if the cleaning lady would cook it or whatever it is, it would follow the rules of a tafshil, of bishul. So basically we'd have to examine where would these things fit in. Commercially, you have Cheerios or Bran Flakes. So they are made out of the chameshas minei dagan and mezainis. So the process basically, let's say about the Cheerios, just in brief. Again, I don't have really expertise on the process. I watched a couple of videos. Baruch Hashem, today it's easy to see, even if you're not an expert, you can still get a general picture of how it's done. So basically, there's a dough which is cooked. By Cheerios, it's not cooked in water; it's cooked in steam, which we mentioned at the end of last year, does affect potentially the halacha when it comes to bishul, because we mentioned that me'ushan, okay, which is smoking, does not apply. Bishul Akkum does not apply to me'ushan. And according to some poskim, they extend that not only to me'ushan, which is cold smoke, but also to kitur, which is steaming. So it could be that process helps, at least if we're talking about bishul. But again, really, we didn't really have so much of a shaila. If it would be a tafshil, it would be the dinim of bishul Akkum. So based on the dinim of oila shulchan malachim, it would already be mutter. Wouldn't really need to go into the whole. You wouldn't really need to go that much into the whole question of the steaming, unless you're machmir, on the issue of potato chips based on certain other concerns which we claimed in last year are not really oisgehalten. So then you could use this svara of this steaming versus the cooking as perhaps to booster a little bit and make it a little bit more lenient. And then basically it's still too moist and they need to dry it out. So it's dried out in some sort of process. And the way it was explained is it's basically, it kind of pops. It kind of takes out all the steam from inside the Cheerio, and that's how it puffs it up and dries it out. So it could be based on that process of that popping process. Don't know what the technical term is. I forgot. Is that that might also take away from the din of pas. In other words, because again, the rule of pas is that it would have to be baked. So if that's a little bit, doesn't really fit the criteria, then I might take it out of the din of pas. Now, what's the difference if it's going to be pas or bishul? Again, if you're talking to a flat bashir, no difference. Because if it's pas, so then it's pas palter, so it's mutter. And if it's a tafshil, so it's bishul, it's also mutter, because it's not shulchan malachim. So the only afkim to a flat bashir would be they're doing the Aseret Simei Tshuva. Do you have to prefer the Yiddish company because the Yiddish company is available? So Pas Yisrael is available. So in such a kind of a situation, you during the Aseret Simei Tshuva, even Ashkenazim would require that you go and buy the Yiddish company. So that would be the extent of the nafkamina. If you're talking someone, Das Achsidim, where like we explained last time, that when it comes to the Chumrah of Pas Palter, even though they're both from the Arizal, but when it comes to the Chumrah of Pas Palter, so that's brought in the poskim, so that's accepted. And that we're all makbid on. When it comes to the chumrah of something which is really oila shulchan malachim, but you shouldn't eat it anyway, b'teiras chumrah. So that second chumrah of the Arizal, even though they're both mentioned in the Arizal, mamish one after the other, that's not quoted in the poskim, and that not everybody follows. So we only mentioned it as a kind of a way of justifying or explaining the hanhaga, which is nafutz, to be makbid on certain things like potato chips and cereals and stuff like that. So that would zikr also apply over here as well. Okay, so it would end up being more or less, at least the way we presented it last week, it would end up being the same exact thing more or less as if it's in the category of a tafshil. If it does. So now, so this question of whether or not it would fit the criteria of pas or tafshil is somewhat of an open question. It would appear just based on the fact that, again, it's kind of a little bit of a circular logic, but that's the metzius of the way of what we're noyig, is that you're not gonna be able to find in Empire Kosher Snyder's bread or something that's pas palter, right? But you will find the Cheerios. I mean, so clearly, even amongst the Avas Chassidim that are makpid on the pas palter, they do accept to some extent, and I'm not saying it's for everybody, I'm saying, but clearly there are those that are never going to touch the OU bread, the pas palter bread with a 10-foot pole, and they will take the Goyish company, the Kellogg's Cheerios. So they're definitely relying on this concept, whether it's the process that it's done, the puffing, or whether it's just a more general thing. There's a concept of toyar lechem or tzuras hapas, which is a little bit undefined, but Rabbi Yisrael told me that he thought that it didn't fit the criteria of, it didn't have that gather of tzuras hapas. So again, that's a discussion out there. So that's the issue behind the breakfast cereal. And with the bran flakes and stuff like that, again, it's not the same exact thing because there's two differences there. First of all, I'm not 100% sure about this, but based on what I just checked up, it doesn't appear. But again, I could be wrong. I don't go to the actual factory. I just try to research it a little bit. It doesn't appear that the cooking, when they cook it originally, it doesn't appear to be steamed. It appears to be actually cooked. Okay, that's one slight difference. And the other is that it doesn't have really a puffing, like a popping process that's done at the end. It's just a toasting thing. In other words, they cook the kernels, they cook the wheat or whatever they're making it out of, and then it goes through like a pressing machine that makes it into like a flake, and then afterwards that flake is toasted. So it's a question kind of like toasting after the cooking, which again would also pose some type of a question of would it have the gedarim of a pas or not? And again, also the question of tzuras hapas. So, and like we said before, they're clearly those that, that are clearly makpid on the din of pas palter, but that are willing to accept the argument that it doesn't really fit the criteria of pas for those reasons mentioned. Okay, I want to go into coffee now a little bit. So coffee, so let's start with the Bishul Akkum because that's what we're discussing, and then we'll segue into the dinim, to the gzeir of Sheikher Akkum, and we'll kind of connect it into generally drinking in a bar, alcoholic beverages, and stuff like that. It's all really a little bit connected. So Chazal made a gzeira, just bahagdam a little bit, and then we'll go into the pratim of this gzeira. Chazal made a gzeira of Sheikher Akkum after Pas Akkum and Bishul Akkum was in the times of the Gemara, and that is not to have beer from a goy. They made it a little bit different than the gzeira of Pas and Bishul. Pas and Bishul, if it's taka aser, if it was made by the goy, so then you can't have it. Period. It doesn't make a difference that you're eating it in the goy's rishus, or you bring it out of the goy's rishus and you bring it into your own home. Aser, it's aser. By Sheikher, they only aser to drink the beer in the goy's house or in the goy's store. But you could take the beer, buy the beer, and bring it home. And like this Maacholei in the Gemara, one opinion is that you just have to take it out of the goy's store. You don't have to bring it home. The other opinion is that you have to bring it home. The Machaber Paskas, you have to bring it home. Other Paskim are more mekel, that it's good enough just to take it out of the goy's store. But in Shulchan Aruch, it says you have to take it home to your rishus. So that's the gzeir of Sheikher Akkum. They made it a little bit differently. In other words, they weren't that strict with it for various reasons, as explained in the Pasuk in the Rishayim. So Kopanim, the question is, Tosfos asked the question right away, why did the Chachamim have to ask Sheikher Akkum, Maacholei that it's Bishul Akkum, right? They cook the water with the hops, with the barley, whatever they're making it out of, right? So it's Bishul Akkum. So what do you need the whole gzeira of Sheikher Akkum for? And Bishul it was already in the Mishnah, and Bishul is more overarching than Sheikher Akkum, because Bishul is saying the goy's rishus, saying your rishus. So what do you need this whole thing for? So Tosfos answers two answers. One, he says it could be that Sheikher is not considered oila shulchan malachim. And again, the din of oila shulchan malachim goes according to the time and place, so you always have to judge. So Tosfos is saying that in that time, it was something which is not oila shulchan malachim, which, by the way, again, it's hard to know historically Okay, let me leave that alone. Okay, I don't want to ruin everyone's train of thought. So the reason one is not Shulchan Malachim, and the second reason Tosfos explains is because it also follows the din of Birchas Hanenin. What bracha do we make on sheicher? What bracha do you make on beer? You don't make the bracha on the barley. Okay, the water is considered the ikr, and that's taka the klal. That anytime if you cook water, whether fruits, vegetables, or even tua, right? But it's only for the purpose of the drink. You don't intend b'chlal to eat the food. So then the bracha is going to be, the ikr is going to be the water, and the bracha is going to be shahako. So really, we're following the din of not what's giving it the flavor so much, which is the tua, but the water. Or by the way, you can make beer out of other stuff, as I'm going to see in a moment. So actually, the beer that they were talking about in the times of the Gemara wasn't actually shecher of tua, the kind that we have, but it was actually shecher tamarim. It was beer that was made out of dates. But upon him, it doesn't have the din of the date or whatever it is, but it has the din of the water. That's the ikr. So since water is nechal chai, so therefore it's not subject to bishul akum. So that's why the shecher is not going to be asim bishul akum. Therefore, the Chachamim made a new gzeira of shecher hakum, which was limited to the goy's rishus. So you have over here a clock. Okay. How do we carry this over to coffee? So let's see. Let's see if the answers of Tosfos carry over to coffee. So the first answer of Oila Shulchan Malachim. So again, it's questionable. Coffee is definitely served at a formal table. So it's a whole big raid in the paskim. Doesn't fit the criteria because really it says when we say that something has to be Oila Shulchan Malachim, so it says it has to be Oila Shulchan Malachim. It means it has to be a lifban. It has to be something that's an accompaniment to the bread. Actually, you have eggs or meat, these kind of things. So it's an accompaniment to the bread. It's eaten together with the bread. It doesn't have to be mamish that you put it on the bread, but it could be you eat it together. So that's one thing that it has to be. The lafis b'yasapas, or also the place can explain even if it's lamazin lahazbiyah. The mushroom potatoes are not lafis b'yasapas, but the potatoes themselves are mazin lahazbiyah. They're you're meant to fill you up. So that's also considered. In other words, if it fits the other criteria, but it would fit the din of Oila Shulchan Malachim, or also the Shulchan Aruch paskins that even if it's the parperes, which means like a dessert or something like that, that would also be. Not all the places can agree to that, but if you hold, so there's a whole raid. So maybe coffee does it fit the criteria? Some want to say maybe it's called the lafais because you dip the cookie in the coffee. I'm talking about this is a raid not in the Heintige Paskin. This is a raid in the mamish in the early Paskin that they discuss this question of coffee, bishul akum and coffee. So they discuss a mitzvah that. They discuss maybe it's leparperes, so even if it's not the lafis b'yasapas. So there's a whole discussion. But l'chayr, the second answer l'chayr is easy. That's explained in the halachas of Birchas Hanenin, that the bracha you make on coffee, right, is shahako, because again, the water is cooked. The coffee beans are cooked with the water is not to eat the coffee beans, but only to drink the water. So and therefore the water is the ikr, and therefore you make shahako. So therefore we judge by the water. So since the water is nechal chai, so therefore coffee is not subject to bishul akum. So you have a clear heter. And again, there could be many other reasons to be makel why bishul akum doesn't apply to the coffee, but you have a clear heter from Tosfos, and that you don't really need to go that much further. So bishul akum it's not. What's with this gzeira of shecher akum? Could you go into the coffee shop, a goyish coffee shop, and so there's a machlekes between the Mechaber and the Ramah, Sfardim and Ashkenazim, basically, what was the gzeira of shecher akum? So the Mechaber learns that shecher akum wasn't just the kind of beer that they had in the times of the Gemara when they instituted the gzeira, which was shecher tmarim, but it applies to all shecher. So shecher tmarim, shecher that's made out of tvua, which is the kind of beer that we have, and the poskim say that most likely it would include mashke. It's also made out of tvua. It won't make a difference if it's called a shecher, if it's called a mashke. I'm talking about yain saraf, like whiskey, or that type of thing, or a vodka. it would all be included. And the place can say most likely, according to the Mechaber, it doesn't have to be an alcoholic beverage necessarily. It has to be a chashuv beverage. So according to many poskim, the Mechaber Shita would most likely include coffee in the Isser of Sheikher Akkum. That to drink the coffee in the Goyish establishment would be problematic, or at least a good, healthy diyun, if you follow the psakim of if you would be a Sfardi. Now, the Ramah paskins very differently. The Ramah holds that Sheikher Akkum was the Gzeira only applies to Sheikher Tmarim, which was the kind of beer that was common in the times of the Gemara when they made the Gzeira. So since that was common, so they only made the Gzeira on what was common, the thing that was shchiach. So they never included everything else. So it doesn't even include regular beer. And kolshkin doesn't include something which is not a beer, like mashke and kolshkin and kolshkin. It doesn't include other chashav and mashkois like coffee and hot cocoa and stuff like that. So therefore, in terms of a question mitzad hadin, if there's any issue of drinking coffee at a Starbucks, at some other type of non-Jewish establishment, certainly there's no isser, not mitzad bishul akum, and also not for Ashkenazim, not mitzad the gzeir of sheikher akum. Again, according to the Arizal, it would zicher be included as a chumra, but there is chumra in bishul akum, but not minadin. Okay. Now there are some poskim who are mechalik a little bit kind of in between, that they say that it applies to all kind of alcoholic beverages, but it doesn't necessarily apply to drinks like coffee and cocoa. So there is some room also. There's kind of like a third shita there as well. But unless you have like that. So strictly speaking, you don't really have an isser, not a bishul akum and not a sheikher akum. That being said, it is important to stress that even amongst the Ashkenazi poskim, the Yaivitz is very, very strong, that it's not something that's encouraged. Okay, the Chachmas Adam speaks about this. It's not encouraged to go and even have just drinks, like non-alcoholic drinks, like coffee, in Goyish establishments. And it's not the place where you go and you hang out and you meet up with your friends and you sit there for half an hour and you go take your work with you and you sit there and you hang out in the whole atmosphere. It's zikr not encouraged. Even for us Ashkenazim, it's clearly not a shaila din. It's definitely not encouraged. Okay. Just on, I guess, me'inyan le'inyan, if we're talking about ordering, let's say, other kind of drinks, not coffee. Coffee is a hot drink. It has other complications. Okay, we're just talking only mitzad bishul akum in cooking the coffee, and mitzad sheikher akum in drinking it in a goyish establishment. We didn't really touch on yet the kashrus concerns of it being, what else is going on in the store there, right? Making sure that what you're actually drinking is kosher. So that we have to get to in a moment. But before we get to that, I guess I'll just in the Indian touch on drinking other alcoholic beverages. So again, for us, for Ashkenazim, it's not really going to be a shaila. You will be allowed to order, you passing by, whatever it is, a bar. It doesn't have to be a bar necessarily. And you could order a drink. It could even be an alcoholic beverage, technically. Maker hadin, if it's not done on a regular basis. You're just, traveling and you don't not such a kviyistic way. So definitely it will be mutter to order. In terms of kashrus concerns, there's not really that much because it's a cold drink. So therefore, you don't want them to put a lemon or anything like that because that's cut with their knife. And Shulchan Aruch assumes that at least what comes out from the paskim is in Hilchos Basar B'Chalav is that we have to assume that they don't have separate knives that they only use for their fruits and vegetables, and we have to assume that the same knife that they use to cut, if they sell other stuff like sandwiches or whatever it is, that they might cut their non-kosher turkey sandwich or whatever it is, and then use the same knife to cut the lemon. That's what we have to assume, that they don't have kelim yuchadim just to cut their fruits and vegetables. So memela and a lemon is charif, so it would definitely be problematic. So you want to ask them specifically not to put the lemon on, okay? But otherwise ordering the drink. Now in terms of the keli, the klal is that if you're allowed to have, comes out from actually in two places, in Hilchos Basar B'Chalav, and it's also in Maacholei Akkum, that if the keli if we have a non-kosher keli or goyish keli, if it's scrubbed very well, you do shifshuf on the keli, so then you're allowed to put in cold kosher food, even if it's wet, like a drink, you're allowed to put it in. Now, from the shach comes out that you're not allowed to put in sharp things, which mashka is sharp, even if they did shifshuf on the keli. Other poskim disagree and hold that if shifshuf was done on the keli, and I'm assuming that the way it's washed would fit the criteria of shifshuf, but it's done with soap and it's scrubbed properly. So why is the oil makel? So I guess most probably it has to do with the fact that the cup wasn't even used for isser, at least hot isser. So the way the oifen, how it may have gotten a blia from isser, may have been the way it was washed, which again we don't have enough time to talk about all of that, but definitely there's a lot of wiggle room and a lot of shittas that it didn't necessarily become treif per se, and the fact that it's usually glass. So there's other shittas that hold that it's not beleya. So there's kind of, so therefore, as long as shifshuf was done on the kli, which generally that's the assumption, you're dealing with a very clean keli. So therefore, you could order the drink, even if it's a mashka and it's a sharp drink, l'choira it's acceptable. And certainly only if it's only a soda, then there's mamish no shaila as far as the keli is concerned. Okay, I do want to mention there's a separate halacha. It could be it's very much connected to this din of the gzeira of Sheikh Akkum, but it's its own thing in a certain sense. It has different criteria. There is a concept called mesibas nachri, which means attending a party of a goyish party. Okay, so that's a little bit different. The Sheikh Akkum is drinking, again, according to each shita, whatever they hold, is drinking the sheikha in the rishus of the goy. It doesn't make a difference if it's a majority goyim or yidden, right? In other words, it would be, according to the Sfardim at least, going into the bar and buying a beer and sitting down and drinking it in a kavua de ka'oifen. Okay, according to for Ashkenazim, so it would be only if it's sheikha tmarim, which is kind of not really benimtza. Okay. So that's what the sheikh, that's what the gzeir of Sheikh Akkum, which is discussed in the Gemara, would be. Mesibas nachri just means that if there's a goyish party, which means if there's roiv goyim at a party and you're invited, let's say there's an office party or whatever it is from your company, and there's roiv goyim there, so you're not allowed to drink at that party. Okay, and that's even if it's in a Yiddish. It means even if your company says, "Oh, yes, we have a bunch of Yiddish workers, so we're going to do good, and we're going to make the party in a Yiddish hall, and we're going to get kosher food." Afal became this din of mesibas nachri, which again is not mentioned before in the Gemara, and it's not brought in Shulchan Aruch. It's from the Rambam and in the Torah, but it's accepted by the Paskim, even though it's not mentioned mamish in the Shulchan Aruch. But that would be this concept. As long as it's roiv goyim. Now, if you go to a restaurant, that's not a mesiba. You're eating your own little table. It doesn't matter that it's roiv goyim technically. In other words, so that. But if it's a party that you're part of this party, so then and this din is not sheikher tmarim. This is any chashav, for sure, any alcoholic beverage, and maybe even any chashav drink. So obviously, it wouldn't include a cup of seltzer, but it might include some other chashav type of drink, even if it's not necessarily alcoholic in nature. That's mesibas nachri. I just wanted to mention it because there's a little bit of confusion of crossover between that. So I just wanted to mention and clarify that idea. Now, b'negeya. The other concern of, let's say, drinking the coffee at Starbucks or even just, and this really is a kashrus concern. So therefore, it's not about drinking it in Starbucks per se, right? It's about even just buying it. There's a kashrus concern. Now, like I said, I'm not in the kashrus industry, so I don't know firsthand, but I'm just going to say what I read, what I researched, what I heard clearly. And again, the stuff that I don't know, I'm not going to say. It appears like this, that plain black coffee doesn't really need a hechsher. In other words, there's no kashrus concern on the coffee itself. Flavor it definitely does. And also, I'm not familiar with all the many different types of drinks that you could order at a Starbucks. Not at all, but I'm just going to say over what I read or what came out. Is that frappuccino, there's also kashrus concern on the actual kashrus of the drink itself. So therefore, those could never be ordered unless we're talking that there's a hechsher on it, okay? But the plain black coffee doesn't need a hechsher. So the concern, the kashrus concern there is the machine that the coffee is made could receive a blia potentially from other things that are also in the store. The ikr through when they're washing them, if they're washed together. So generally, it's assumed like this: that if we're talking about like a gas station, they just have coffee. Maybe they have a couple of sandwiches in the fridge, but it's not a whole cafe restaurant where they have hot food and they're therefore washing the pots and the dishes and everything together. They have a coffee machine, and before they change the coffee, if you're lucky, they go over to the sink and they rinse it out, and then they put the thing back in, or they just put the new coffee back in, and that's it. So such a thing, there's no kashrus concern. If you're ordering plain coffee, because that's kosher and it is not going to receive a bli, it's not washed with anything treif. So those kind of places, it could even be a Starbucks. In other words, there's in some areas they have Starbucks or Dunkin' Donuts or whatever it is, where it's the ikr you can have in a place like an airport, whatever it is, where they don't. It's not much a whole full-on restaurant or cafe. They have the coffee and they have maybe some cold sandwiches or whatever it is, but there's no real dishes that they're washing together. So in that, there's no real kashrus concern in the plain black unflavored coffee. And what you want to add in, so that's again, so if it's soy milk and it has it's kosher, is good. If you don't keep all of Yisrael, so then, but what you're adding in after is what you're adding in. But the coffee itself, that doesn't seem to be a concern. If you're going into a restaurant type of place, a cafe type of place where they have other things, so then there's a concern that when the dishes are washed together, potentially, or they're in the dishwasher, there's different methods, basically. There's a dishwasher method that they're sometimes washed, or sometimes there's like a sink method that they're washed in one sink, then another sink, then another sink. But there's potential concern, okay, in both of those things. Now, in terms of Yad L'Tayr V'Yadir, or if we were talking about a Shasat Chat Gadol and it's mamish necessary, so there's definitely makom lefalfel and to discuss in the paskim, especially when you get to washing dishes. You're talking the irui, and irui is all machlokes if we mafut mavliya ke'echad from one keli to another keli. If the dishes are dirty, so then it's more of a concern. But then there's the soap issue. There's a lot of, usually it's washed first with soap and then later without soap. So there's a lot of room to discuss this idea. And it could be, if you sweat it out, you could find something to be saimach in a situation of shasat chak and other types of situations where it's necessary. It has din of b'diavad. There may be some room, if you sweat it out really hard, that you can find the kul. I'm not saying not, but in Chloe, unless you taka find out from the way that it's taka washed, you go into that location, that particular location, you speak to the manager. Most probably you could be saimach on him in these kind of situations. There's a concept of uman l'meirum naseh, so he's not going to lie, or you get into the mesech lefitumai. Most probably you could rely on him, and if it turns out, and you know a little bit of your idea, and you know siman tzadikei, you know all the dinim of washing the dishes, and you know all the poskim over there, all the prima gadims, and it comes out from you that the way in that particular location, the way the system that they have, the way they wash it, is not really a concern. So then taka, there's no be'etzim a problem with it if you found out that that's not of a concern. But ba'ifin kloli, you would have to generalize. If you would have to generalize, so generally you would have to say that it's probably better not to do that. And again, not saying that if it's a shasat chad gadol, it's not possible to sweat out something to rely on. Could be, yeah, but definitely in the first instance, there's definitely, it's definitely a problematic kind of thing if they're taka washing the pieces of the coffee machine, in other words, the basket that has the coffee with the thing, together with other stuff that they sell. And you have to assume like that. Again, unless there's a very strict protocol and process, and you find out how it's done, and it turns out that based on the dinim mitzvah tzadikei, there's no real issue with the Yavin. Okay. I do want to mention, I guess, again, like I don't really know all the different kinds of coffees that they have over there, but I was trying to listen into a few different people from different kashrus organizations before I talk over here. And apparently there is a kind of a brew that they have called an Americana, that it has its own separate machine, and that it doesn't have any parts that are washed together with anything else. And that tastes almost the same like a regular black coffee from the regular drip. And that you could have even in a kind of a store that they sell all hot dishes, and there's concern that they wash things together, because that machine, the way that those parts of the machine are never really washed together with anything else. Okay, I have a few more minutes, so we're not going to we won't waste the time. I'll mention something, again, not really related to the products. The most of the things that we were talking about were the Maacholei Akkum related issues that have to do with products. I want to just fear ice. We had already 2 shiurim about Maacholei Akkum, a little bit about in the house. You know, sometimes if a cleaning lady could cook, so it could be a shiloh of Maacholei Akkum. I don't know if we mentioned last time or not, there's a machlokes in the paskim, in the Rashba and the Ra'ah, machlokes in the Rishonim, it's brought the halacha, a question if Maacholei Akkum asers kalim, and generally we follow the stricter shita. Pas Akkum doesn't, but Maacholei Akkum does aser the kalim. So if something is Maacholei Akkum, so it's not just that you can't eat the food, but it's also that you'll have to kasher the kalim. So there is a concern, there's something you have to be careful with. I'll just say, I guess, one klalistic thing. I guess 2 klalistic things. 2 situations where b'diavad you'll be able to be makel. So one situation would be those older model ovens, or the simpler ones. I don't know if it necessarily has to be older, but the simpler ones that have a pilot light. So if a yid lit the pilot light, so then that's something to be soymech on b'diavad. Again, we're not supposed to be soymech on this lechatchila to say that a yid lit the pilot light, so therefore a goy could just turn on the fire. There's such a hatter that the Ramah brings down. It's called Eish Me'esh, that if a yid lights the fire and then the goy uses that fire and he lights a second fire, so then it's still not awesome with some Maacholei Akkum, even whatever is cooked over there, potatoes, rice, whatever. So that hatter, the later paskim, the Neisakadim, the Shach and Taz, are not comfortable relying on that. It's not something you're supposed to rely on lechatchila and say, oh, a yid lit the pilot light. But b'diavad, talking about eating the food or kashering the kalim, befrat when it's done by Beis Yisrael, because it's talking about in your house, so that's an additional thing to be soymech on. So definitely you could be makel b'diavad, all right, if a guy cooked the food, even if she turned on the fire from the beginning to end, and she cooked something which is not nechal chai, and it's oil shulchan malachim, she cooked lakshin, she cooked potatoes, she cooked meat, right? So then you can make a b'diavad if a yid at the fire light. The second situation, where even if she did the cooking from beginning to end, you might be able to make a b'diavad, is in a case of a cleaning lady. If someone's a worker. Why? Because there is a shita that holds that if the goy is your worker, again, there's really 2 shittas. The Ramban holds that your worker is not enough. It has to be that it's an eved, that you own her, that the eved is kanui to the adain, at least l'maisa yadav. So then the peulis of that eved are misyachas to the adain and misyachas to the person who owns that slave. So that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about a regular worker. But there is a second svar that the way the Rashba quotes the hatter, he himself doesn't paskin like this, but the way the Rashba quotes the hatter is heyois, that the goy is muchrach to do it because he's your worker. So therefore, there's no kirva in the fact that she's cooking it. So that heter is generally assumed that will be applicable to a regular worker that you have. But it's important that and the Rashba himself is not soymech on it; he asers it. Okay, so it's a machlokes if this is a heter or not. But b'diavad, if it's number one, Beis Yisrael, which most of the time what we're talking about here is that it was done in your house. So you have that sheet of Rabbi Avraham that holds that in Beis Yisrael there's no Maacholei Akkum. And in addition to that, it was the person who was doing it was with Torahs being your poil, that you hired her and she was mufrach to do whatever you asked from her during the time that she's your poil. So then you have that additional svara, and that's enough. Again, not to be soymech on lechatchila to say that you can go ahead and cook whatever you want, but to be matir the food b'diavad, that it shouldn't be awesome and Maacholei Akkum, and you shouldn't have to kasher the kalim. If it was done in that situation, it will be good. But you have to remember that the only time that will be applicable is if she's cooking for you, which means that the cooking was done as your poil. If she was cooking for herself, which means in that act of her cooking, it wasn't being done as your worker, she wasn't mukhrif to do that, she was doing that for herself, so then you don't have this heter, and then that food, the remaining food, would be awesome with some Maacholei Akkum, and you would have to kasher the kalim in that situation.